Black Sea churned under a leaden sky, its waves crashing against the rocky cliffs of Snake Island on February 24th, 2022. A cold wind howled, carrying the distant rumble of engines from a looming warship, its silhouette a dark omen on the horizon. In a small concrete bunker, Roman, a young Ukrainian border guard, stood at a radio console, his hand steady but his heart racing. The crackle of the radio filled the room, a voice in a foreign tongue demanding surrender. The words were sharp, unyielding, a command to abandon the island. Roman's eyes met those of his comrades, 7 men, their faces taut with resolve, their breaths visible in the chill. Outside, the sea roared, a restless giant bearing witness. The island, a speck of rock in the vast Black Sea, felt like the edge of the world. Roman's fingers tightened on the radio, his mind flashing to his mother's kitchen in Venezia. The smell of bread, her quiet prayers. The voice on the radio repeated its demand, colder now, edged with threat. Roman glanced at Bohdan, the unit's leader, whose weathered face held a defiance that burned brighter than fear. Without a word, Bohdan nodded, and Roman leaned into the microphone. His voice, steady despite the tremor in his chest, cut through the static. "Go to hell." The words hung in the air, a spark in the dark, a refusal that would echo far beyond the island. What led these men to this moment, to stand firm on a lonely rock against an overwhelming force? Days earlier, in the quiet before the storm, they had prepared for a duty that would become a legend. The island's edge, context. Snake Island, a rugged outcrop in the Black Sea, stood alone against the vast expanse of water, its cliffs rising defiantly from the waves. On February 24th, 2022, this small speck of Ukrainian territory, barely a kilometer wide, became a focal point of a conflict that would ripple across the world. The island, known as Zminy, was a strategic outpost, its position guarding key maritime routes. Its rocky terrain, dotted with a lighthouse, a small barracks, and a radio tower, offered little cover, exposed to the elements and any force that approached by sea or air. The Black Sea, restless under a winter sky, churned with heavy waves, the wind carrying a bitter chill that cut through uniforms. The situation was tense from the outset. A Ukrainian border guard unit, fewer than a dozen men, held the island, equipped with basic weapons and a single radio system. Their role was to monitor maritime traffic, a routine task that had taken on new weight as tensions escalated in the region. Across the water, a naval force approached, its warships looming like storm clouds, their intent clear in their slow, deliberate advance. The Ukrainians, under the command of Bohdan, a seasoned officer, faced overwhelming odds. Limited supplies, no reinforcements, and the vast sea isolating them from support. The broader world was in upheaval. That same day, reports of conflict flared across borders. Cities braced for impact, and global attention turned to the unfolding crisis. On the island, the weather mirrored the turmoil. A cold front brought gusting winds and a sky heavy with clouds. The sea's roar a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The guards knew their post was symbolic, a marker of sovereignty, but also a target. Their orders were simple: maintain control, report movements, hold as long as possible. For the men on Snake Island, the stakes were personal as much as they were strategic. They were not a large force, but a tight-knit group, bound by shared duty and the knowledge that their stand, however small, carried the weight of a nation's resolve. As the warships drew closer, their radios crackled with demands, and the men prepared for a moment that would test their courage. The island, battered by wind and waves, stood as a microcosm of a larger struggle, its isolation amplifying the human cost of what was to come. Voices of the Rock, characters. Roman Hrehorovich, 24, was the youngest of the border guards stationed on Snake Island. Born in Vinnytsia, a city of quiet streets and blooming orchards, he had grown up helping his mother tend a small bakery, the warmth of fresh bread a constant in his childhood. His dark hair, often unruly, and his quick, thoughtful eyes gave him a boyish charm. But the months on the island had etched lines of resolve into his face. Roman had joined the border guard service 2 years earlier, driven by a desire to see the sea and a quiet pride in protecting his country's edges. A small notebook in his pocket held sketches of the waves, drawn in stolen moments, a dream of one day painting the Black Sea's restless beauty. Roman's inner world was a mix of duty and longing. He carried the memory of his mother's voice, her nightly prayers for his safety, and the letters she sent, filled with news of home. Fear was a quiet shadow, not of the sea or the enemy, but of failing those who believed in him. Yet he found strength in small things, the way the lighthouse beam cut through the fog, the camaraderie of his unit, the hope that his sketches might one day hang in a gallery. Bohdan, the unit's commander, was 40, a man of few words but deep conviction. From Odessa, he had served on ships before taking the island post, his weathered hands and steady gaze reflecting years at sea. His wife and 2 daughters were his anchor, their photographs tucked into his journal, though he rarely looked at them, afraid the ache would dull his focus. Bohdan's calm masked a fierce resolve. He saw his men as family, and his leadership was rooted in keeping them whole, body and spirit. Olena, the unit's radio operator, was 27, with a sharp wit and a knack for fixing anything mechanical. Raised in a small village near Kherson, she had joined to escape a life of predictable routines, drawn to the challenge of the border guard. Her laughter was a rare gift on the island, lifting spirits during long nights. She dreamed of opening a repair shop, but for now, her world was the radio, its static her lifeline to the mainland. Olena hid her fears behind quick jokes, but her hands trembled when she thought of her aging father, alone back home. Together, Roman, Bohdan, and Olena formed the heart of the small unit. They shared meals of canned fish, traded stories of childhood, and found comfort in their shared purpose. Each carried a private weight, Roman's sketches, Bohdan's family, Olena's father, but together they were a bulwark, their bond a quiet defiance against the storm gathering on the horizon. Shadows on the horizon. Movement. The dawn of February 24, 2022, broke cold and grey over Snake Island, the Black Sea's waves crashing against its rocky shores with relentless fury. The wind carried a sharp bite, tugging at the faded Ukrainian flag atop the island's lone lighthouse. Roman's unit, a small band of border guards, moved with quiet purpose, their boots crunching on the gravel path that wound through the island's sparse terrain. Their task was simple but vital: monitor the sea, maintain the radio, and report any activity. The island, a jagged outcrop barely a kilometer wide, offered little room to maneuver, its cliffs and concrete bunkers exposed to the elements and any approaching threat. Roman walked toward the radio tower, his pack light but his heart heavy with an unspoken tension. The sea stretched endless before him, its surface churned by the wind, a restless mirror reflecting the clouds above. Bohdan led the group, his steps measured, his eyes scanning the horizon where a faint haze blurred the line between sea and sky. Olena followed close behind, her radio equipment slung across her back, her fingers already adjusting dials to catch faint signals. The unit, 7 in total, moved as one, their silence broken only by the creak of gear and the sea's constant roar. The island itself was a stark world, Low shrubs clung to the rocky soil, battered by salt and wind. The barracks, a squat concrete building, stood near the lighthouse, its walls weathered by years of storms. A narrow path led to the cliffs, where the guards often stood watch, their binoculars trained on the water. Today the air felt different, thicker, charged with a weight that pressed against Roman's chest. Reports had trickled in over the radio. Movements on the mainland, distant booms, a world shifting beyond their reach. They knew their post was isolated, their resources limited, but they also knew its importance, a solitary marker of resolve in a turbulent sea. As they reached the radio tower, the first sign of trouble emerged. Olena's radio hissed, a voice cutting through the static, speaking in clipped tones they all recognized. Bohdan signaled for silence, his face unreadable as he listened. The voice spoke of ships, coordinates, a demand for contact. Roman's pulse quickened, his hand brushing the notebook in his pocket, its sketches of waves now a distant comfort. The unit gathered in the bunker, a cramped space lit by a flickering bulb, the walls damp with sea air. Bohdan checked their equipment, rifles, a few grenades, a single anti-tank launcher, meager against what might come. The journey to their posts was short, but tense. They spread out, Roman and Olena at the radio, Bohdan at the cliff's edge with binoculars. The sea was alive, its waves a restless pulse, and far out a shadow grew, a warship, its outline sharp against the dawn. The men exchanged glances, their breaths visible in the cold. Olena whispered a joke about the ship's size, but her voice trembled. Roman managed a faint smile, his thoughts drifting to his mother's bakery, the warmth of her hands. A moment of quiet settled. The calm before a storm, as the lighthouse beam swept over the water, catching the distant glint of steel. The radio crackled again, the voice now clear, demanding a response. Bohdan's jaw tightened, his hand resting on his rifle. Roman felt the weight of the moment, the island's isolation, a mirror to their own. They were far from home, yet home was why they stood here, their boots rooted to the rock, their hearts tethered to those they loved. The ships drew closer, and the unit braced for what would come next. The storm breaks. The battle begins. The Black Sea roared, its waves slamming against Snake Island's cliffs as the warships loomed closer, their grey hulls cutting through the morning haze. It was February 24th, 2022, and the small Ukrainian outpost, a cluster of concrete and steel, stood exposed under a sky heavy with clouds. Roman crouched in the bunker, his hand steady on the radio console, the static a harsh pulse in the cramped space. Olena knelt beside him, her fingers dancing across dials, coaxing faint signals from the mainland. Bohdan stood at the bunker's entrance, binoculars pressed to his eyes, his silhouette rigid against the flickering light of the lighthouse. The air was thick with salt and tension, the wind carrying the low growl of engines from the approaching ships. The radio crackled, a voice breaking through, cold and authoritative, speaking in a language that needed no translation. It demanded surrender, the words sharp, promising safety for compliance. Roman's heart thudded, his mind flashing to his mother's face, her hands kneading dough in their Venezia kitchen. He glanced at Bohdan, whose jaw was set, his eyes burning with a quiet fire. The unit, 7 guards in total, gathered close, their faces pale but resolute, their rifles resting against the bunker's damp walls. The voice repeated its demand, the tone harder now, edged with a threat that hung like the storm clouds above. Bohdan lowered his binoculars, his voice low but clear. "We hold." The words were a vow, binding them to the rock they stood on. Roman nodded, his throat tight, and Olena adjusted the radio, her hands trembling but precise. The ships were visible now, 2 of them, their turrets swiveling, their decks bristling with intent. The island's defenses were meager, a few rifles, a single launcher, a radio that was their only link to the world. The odds were stark, but retreat was not a word they knew. The first challenge came not with gunfire, but with silence. The radio fell quiet, the mainland signals lost in a sudden burst of static. Olena cursed softly, smacking the console, her eyes darting to Bodan. "Jamming," she said, her voice tight. Without communication, they were truly alone. The sea a vast barrier between them and help. Roman's fingers gripped the radio, his mind racing. The ships edged closer, their shadows swallowing the horizon, and a new sound joined the waves, a low hum, drones circling above, their red lights blinking like eyes in the dawn. Bodan moved swiftly, assigning positions. Roman and Olena stayed at the radio, tasked with restoring contact, while the others spread out to the cliffs and barracks, their movements quick but deliberate. The bunker's walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with the weight of what was coming. Then, a sharp crack, a warning shot from the lead ship, the round splashing into the sea near the cliffs. The unit froze, their breaths shallow, the reality of their isolation sinking in. Bodan raised a hand, signaling calm, but his eyes never left the ships. Roman's pulse raced as he worked the radio, his fingers fumbling through static. Olena whispered coordinates, her voice a thread of focus in the chaos. Outside, the drones dipped lower, their hum a relentless pressure. A second demand came over the radio, the voice colder now, promising no mercy for defiance. Bodan stepped to the console, his face unyielding. He took the microphone from Roman, his words deliberate, each one a spark in the dark. "Go to hell," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the static like a blade. The unit held its breath, the words a defiance that burned brighter than fear. The ships responded with a low rumble, their cannons adjusting. Roman's hands shook, but he kept working, driven by Bodan's resolve, by Olena's quiet strength beside him. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, as the unit braced for the storm. They were a handful against a fleet, but their stand was not about numbers. It was about the fire in their hearts, the refusal to bend, the love for a home far beyond the waves. The rock stands firm, the sacrifice. The Black Sea churned, its waves a relentless drumbeat against Snake Island's cliffs as the warships closed in, their grey forms now sharp against the morning sky. The air was heavy with salt and the acrid tang of impending conflict. The drones hum, a constant pressure overhead. Inside the bunker, Roman's hands trembled on the radio console, the static a maddening wall between them and the mainland. Olena worked beside him, her fingers coaxing faint signals, her face set in fierce concentration. Bodan stood at the entrance, his silhouette framed by the lighthouse's beam, his eyes fixed on the approaching ships. The unit, 7 border guards bound by duty, faced a moment that would define them. The radio crackled again, the foreign voice repeating its ultimatum, its tone now a blade promising no quarter. Bodan's words, "Go to hell," still hung in the air, a defiance that had set the island ablaze with resolve. The ships responded with a low rumble, their cannons swiveling, their intent clear. The drones circled closer, their red lights piercing the haze, guiding the warship's aim. The island's defenses were sparse, rifles, a single launcher, and their will to stand. The odds were crushing, but surrender was not in their blood. The first real threat came with a flash. A shell from the lead ship arced across the sea, exploding near the cliffs, sending a spray of rock and water into the air. The bunker shook, dust falling from the ceiling, and Roman's heart pounded, his mind flashing to his mother's bakery, the warmth of her hands. Olena cursed under her breath, her radio still silent, the jamming cutting them off from hope. Bohdan shouted orders, his voice steady, directing the unit to their posts. 2 guards scrambled to the cliffs, their rifles ready, while another checked the launcher, its single shot a fragile hope against the steel giants. Then came the moment that would bind them forever. The drones, relentless in their surveillance, dipped lower, one hovering near the radio tower, its camera trained on the bunker. If it relayed their position, the next shell would find them. Bohdan's eyes met Olena's, a silent understanding passing between them. The tower was their lifeline, their only chance to restore contact, but reaching it meant crossing open ground, exposed to the drones and the ship's fire. Olena, smaller and faster, set down her radio, her jaw tight. "I can do it," she said, her voice low but firm. Roman started to protest, but Bohdan's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "She's our best shot," he said, his eyes heavy with the weight of the decision. Olena grabbed a toolkit, her movement swift, and darted out of the bunker. The wind tore at her, the sea's roar drowning out the drone's hum. Roman watched, his breath caught, as she sprinted across the rocky path, her figure small against the cliffs. A drone shifted, its light tracking her, and a burst of gunfire from the ship peppered the ground nearby. She dove behind a boulder, her hands already working to repair the tower's wiring. The shelling intensified, a second round striking closer, the shockwave rattling the bunker. Roman's hands shook as he tried the radio again, his voice hoarse, calling for any response. Bohdan stood at the entrance, firing short bursts to draw attention from Olena. The unit held their positions, their faces pale but resolute, each man carrying the weight of their choice to stand. Olena's figure emerged again, climbing the tower's base, her tools glinting in the faint light. A drone swooped low, its hum a scream, and Roman's heart stopped as a shot rang out, grazing the rock near her. With a final twist of her wrench, Olena restored the signal, the radio bursting to life with a mainland voice. She slid down, sprinting back as the drones adjusted, their lights locking on. Roman and Bohdan covered her, their rifles barking, and she dove into the bunker, breathless but alive. The radio crackled with coordinates, a faint promise of support. The ships paused, their cannons still, as if weighing the defiance from this tiny rock. Olena's act had bought them time, a fragile thread of hope in the storm, but the cost was etched in their eyes, the knowledge that the next moment might demand more. Echoes on the waves. Aftermath. The roar of the Black Sea filled the silence as the warships retreated, their grey forms fading into the haze on the horizon. Snake Island stood battered but unbroken, its cliffs scarred by shelling, the lighthouse still casting its beam across the restless water. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and smoke, the ground littered with shards of rock and twisted metal from the barrage. Inside the bunker, Roman's unit gathered, their faces pale under the flicker of a single bulb, their breaths uneven in the aftermath. The radio, brought back to life by Olena's daring run, crackled faintly, a lifeline to a world that seemed impossibly far away. Roman sat against the damp wall, his hands still clutching the radio console, his heart slowing from its frantic pace. Olena, her face smudged with dirt, leaned nearby, her toolkit discarded, her breath steady, but her eyes distant. Bohdan stood at the entrance, his binoculars lowered, his gaze fixed on the sea, as if expecting the ships to return. The unit was intact. No one had fallen, though the weight of their stand pressed heavily on them. The cliffs bore new scars, the radio tower leaned slightly from the shelling, and the flag above the lighthouse hung tattered but proud, its blue and yellow frayed by the wind. The cost was not measured in lives lost, but in the quiet toll of endurance. The shelling had shaken the island, its echoes lingering in the men's ears, in the tremor of their hands. Roman's thoughts drifted to his notebook, its sketches of waves now a distant dream, replaced by the jagged lines of reality. He reached for it, tracing the pages, finding solace in the memory of his mother's voice, her prayers carried across the miles. Olena, beside him, pulled out a small locket, her father's gift, and held it tightly, her usual wit replaced by a quiet resolve. Bohdan, ever stoic, checked on each man, his voice low, offering no grand words, only presence. The radio crackled with a faint message from the mainland, promising support but no timeline. The unit knew the truth. They were still alone, their stand a fragile thread in a larger tapestry. The ships had withdrawn, perhaps to regroup, perhaps deterred by the defiance that had rung out over the airwaves. Bohdan's words, "Go to hell," had become their shield, a spark that had held the line. But the silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken question of what came next. The sea stretched endless, its waves a reminder of their isolation, yet also of their resilience. As night fell, the unit shared a sparse meal of canned rations, the taste metallic but grounding. The lighthouse beam swept over the island, catching the glint of scattered debris, a spent shell casing, a broken radio antenna, signs of a moment that had changed them. Roman looked at his comrades, their faces lit by the dim lantern, and saw not just soldiers but brothers and sisters, bound by a choice to stand firm. The island was theirs for now, its rocks a testament to their refusal to yield. The war would continue, its shadow looming beyond the horizon, but in this moment they had held, and that was enough. A whisper to the sea. Reflection? The Black Sea whispered its endless song as night cloaked Snake Island, the stars above hidden by a veil of clouds. The bunker's single bulb flickered, casting shadows across the faces of Roman, Olena, and Bohdan, who sat in a tight circle, their silence a shared language. The lighthouse beam swept over the island, its light cutting through the darkness, a steady rhythm against the chaos of the day. The air was cool, heavy with salt, and the faint scent of smoke lingered, a reminder of the shelling that had scarred the cliffs. The radio, now quiet, sat in the corner, its static replaced by the sea's low roar. Roman held his notebook, its pages worn from months of salt and wind. He traced a sketch of the waves, drawn in a moment of calm before the world had shifted. The lines were rough, but they held the memory of his mother's voice, her stories of Venezia's fields, her hope that he'd return. He began to write, the pencil scratching softly, words meant for her, but perhaps never sent. "Mama," he wrote, "today we stood on this rock, and I thought of you. The sea is vast, but it carries your prayers. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I carry you with me." The act of writing was a tether, a way to hold on to home amidst the uncertainty. Olena sat nearby, her locket open, her father's face gazing out from a faded photograph. She hadn't spoken much since her run to the tower, but her eyes held a quiet strength, a fire that hadn't dimmed. She thought of her village near Kherson, the way the river caught the sunset, and her dream of a repair shop filled with the hum of machines. Bohdan, his journal resting on his knee, stared out at the sea, his thoughts with his daughters in Odessa. He hadn't written to them today, but his silence was a prayer, a hope that they'd know his love, even from this lonely rock. The stand on Snake Island was more than a moment. It was a testament to the human spirit, to the choice to hold firm when the world demanded surrender. Their defiance, Bohdan's words broadcast to the world, had become a spark, a story that would carry far beyond the sea. They were not soldiers of legend, but ordinary men and women, bound by love for home, for each other, for the fragile hope of a future unshattered. The island, small and scarred, stood as a mirror to their resolve, its rocks unyielding against the waves. As the night deepened, Roman closed his notebook, tucking it beside his heart. Olena slipped her locket back into her pocket, and Bohdan stood, his silhouette merging with the lighthouse's beam. They didn't speak of the war that waited, or the ships that might return. Instead, they shared a quiet glance, a promise to stand together, no matter what came. The sea whispered on, carrying their story, their courage, their humanity. For those who hear this tale, let it settle in your heart. What does it mean to stand for something greater than yourself? To speak defiance in the face of a storm? Share your thoughts below. What keeps us anchored when the world trembles? Subscribe to Ukraine Frontline War Stories for more tales of resilience and heart. Stories that remind us of the light that endures, even on the edge of the sea.